Scientific studies. Why aren't there more of them when it comes to dietary supplements? Today, we're going to explore exactly that question. Hi, I'm Christian Baker, founder and CEO of Profound Formulas. I make supplements for companies which result in customers actually feeling something and having them wanting to come back time and time again to buy it. If you're an e-commerce entrepreneur looking to enter the supplement space or an existing supplement company looking to expand your line to something more premium, you may find this video particularly helpful. So when it comes to scientific studies, I'm going to break it down for you into 5 different tiers. Tier 1. These are companies who fund their own studies. And they're actual properly done scientific studies with all the rigor that people look for, like double-blind, placebo, peer-reviewed, all that stuff. Proper guardrails, fully funded, like done to the actual standard. You can find these studies not just on the company's website, but you can actually find them in the usual libraries that you look for scientific studies, such as the National Institute of Health, otherwise known as PubMed. And I'm going to highlight 3 brands for you to illustrate this further. So, brand number 1, AG1, arguably the most famous greens company on the planet. Now, they were bootstrapped since they launched in 2009. And the company gathered momentum, had many ups and downs along the way. And eventually, 12 years later, in 2021, they raised money for the first time. And then another 1 or 2 years later, they started funding studies. And in 2024, the first studies on their actual finished product were published. So this is 15 years after launching the company. And they funded a variety of studies. They used it to make their next gen, which is just a fancy word for an updated version of their formula. In total, they put in over $20 million to fund these studies. So that gives you an idea of the kind of money that it takes to do a proper study. The next brand is Seed. This is a probiotic, but it contains prebiotic fiber as well as probiotic bacteria. Therefore, they market it as a synbiotic because these things work in synergy. Very clever marketing. Now, these guys actually raised seed capital, pun intended, before they even launched. And one of the funders was Founders Fund, aka Peter Thiel's firm, aka one of the biggest tech investors in the entire planet. So if you're going to raise money from these people, it's probably not going to be a small amount of money. They didn't disclose how much they raised, but it's very unlikely to be less than, say, 10 or 20 million. They conducted a lot of studies before they even launched their product, because one of the biggest marketing angles is that they have this new symbiotic technology, and they do have published studies on their DS-01 probiotic, and you can find them again in libraries of clinical studies. 3 short years later, after they launched, they raised another 40 million for expansion, growth, and whatever, but they're also putting more of that money into studies. Again, highlighting how much resources it takes to properly do studies. And finally, a brand that I'm also a fan of, Ritual. It is very much targeted at women, though they are starting to expand their line into men. Their founder, Katarina Markov-Schneider, made her product with a really cool founder story. She was looking for a prenatal multivitamin for herself, and she was really frustrated with what she saw on the market, so she went and invented one herself. And always from the beginning, they'll have a lot of nice touches. Obviously, very clean ingredients, good doses. They have, for example, helped double down on things which are especially important for women trying to get pregnant, such as using a good version of folate, not folic acid, but something called 5-methylfolate. But I don't want to get too much into the weeds. Either way, high standards, good label, doing a lot of things right from day one. In the beginning, however, they leveraged more off studies that was done on one of the ingredients in their product, something called quadrafolic. And then later, when they had a bit more momentum and more resources behind them, they funded their own studies as well. And they've now got officially the first women-specific multivitamin with clinical studies. But again, when it came to doing those studies, they invested over 5 million. So a recurring theme of this tier 1 is that it takes a ton of money. And this is one of the fastest answers to the question, why aren't there more scientific studies on dietary supplements? It's because it takes a ton of money. If you're starting a company and you've got like, $100,000, you can't even fund a tenth of a study, but you could probably spend that on marketing and helping get some staff to help you grow the business. So that's why you find a lot of companies do studies later rather than earlier. Moving on to tier 2. Tier 2 is branded ingredients. So this means you don't fund studies that are done on your finished product. You instead pay to use a fancy branded version of an ingredient that you base your formula around. Now this sounds complicated, but I'll illustrate it with a product. So this is a product which contains ashwagandha, a herb that is useful for relaxing, reducing stress, and with sleep. And front and center in big text, there are the words KSM 66 ashwagandha. That is a branded version of ashwagandha. There is a company in India who has invested a ton of money into doing studies on their specific strain of ashwagandha. And those studies, like we mentioned before with the other finished products, those studies are available, again, in PubMed and other places you can find them. And if you're a brand launching a product that is either just ashwagandha or a mix of ingredients, and one of them is ashwagandha, you can pay for this ingredient more than you would normally pay for regular ashwagandha. And because you've paid this price, you've put it in your product, it's on your label, you get to benefit from the studies that they have done. So you're allowed to make stronger claims, you're allowed to say better things on your website, you can also say more distinct claims on your label, as long as you follow the rules that the brand has laid out. So it's their trademark, so you have to follow certain rules. You need to represent their brand properly, put the font correctly in your label, all these different things. But yeah, so you haven't paid for a study, but you are paying for an ingredient who has done the studies. Other examples include Magtine magnesium. So Magtine is a branded version of magnesium threonate. That's magnesium bonded with the amino acid L-threonate. And also another ingredient is something called cognizin, because it's meant to make you think of cognition in the mind. And that's a branded version of cytocholine, a substance which helps with brain power, memory, and focus. The interesting thing about these last two, Magtine and cognizin, is that sometimes people get confused, consumers do, and they think that this is a distinct ingredient. So they see your product has magnesium, but they think it's not complete because it doesn't have Magtine. Or they see you have cognizin, or they see you have cytocholine, and they see that it's not cognizin, so they don't understand. So there is a little bit of confusion. And again, it does add to the marketing firepower you can have when you pay for these brands. Moving on to tier 3. Tier 3 involves using ingredients that are famous, well-known, very well studied, and using them in a way that they are delivered in the study. For example, creatine, especially creatine monohydrate, is one of the most studied ingredients on the entire planet. They've been doing clinical studies since the 80s and 90s, and studies abound talking about creatine for athletic performance, but also brain power, memory, cognitive function. And they're very clear that the effective dose is typically 5 grams per day, and then you can get increased results at 10 grams and things like that, and then there's diminishing returns above 20. So if a brand wants to use creatine and they use 5 grams, they can then say, well, our formula has scientifically studied ingredients, which is technically true, but they're starting to blur the lines here because it's not like their formula has anything that's been studied scientifically. They're just putting something in which someone else has studied. So you're starting to blur the line a little bit here. But as long as you put in the proper dose and a good quality version of that ingredient, it's still fairly credible. And a lot of brands do this. So, you've got creatine at 5 grams. You've got, coenzyme Q10 at 200 or 300 milligrams, things like that. So you want to make sure you actually have the right ingredient in the right dose, which brings us to tier 4. This is when brands claim they have scientifically studied ingredients, which is technically true, like tier 3, but they try to cut corners and reduce their costs, and they don't put in the right dose. For example, there are a lot of creatine gummy companies getting caught putting in low doses of creatine in their products. So they were claiming they were giving you a 5-gram dose, but instead you were getting 3 grams or 2 grams, or in some cases even 1 gram. That's deceptive, and on the label it said 5 grams, so those people should definitely get in trouble, as many of them are. But there are other instances where companies put something on the label, for example, let's say ashwagandha that we talked about before, and instead of putting in the scientifically studied doses of 300 milligrams or 600 milligrams, these are strong doses by the way, they put in a tiny amount, say like 50 milligrams. And to the consumer, they still see the word ashwagandha on the label, and in the marketing, these brands will often still talk about the ashwagandha they have and how great it is. But at this tiny dose, it's not going to do anything. So this is very deceptive. It's unethical. It's usually done on purpose to cut corners and try to cut costs. Or it's done by an uninformed company who just takes blind recommendations from the manufacturer, for example, to bring down the cost without really understanding what they're sacrificing to do that. So it's not always done on purpose, but it's still, it can't really be excused. You need to really ask around before you push something like that out into the world. And finally, tier 5, the trash tier. This is companies who, they use anecdotes about an ingredient like, yeah, my friend's grandma used to take this thing and, it's totally going to work for you. Or they use quotes from podcasts like, yeah, this guy on the podcast show said he takes this thing every day and it makes him feel amazing, Or they use, poorly done studies, for example, in vitro studies. So in vitro means they've done something in a test tube or a petri dish, but not inside a human body or even an animal. So it's very kind of sketchy, especially when it comes to supplements. We're not talking about drugs here. Or maybe they pull something from a blog post and they claim that as their evidence, but tier 5 is trash and you can't really excuse yourself. It's just dodgy. So usually in this tier, it's pretty hard for a company to honestly make a mistake when doing this tier. It's usually done on purpose. They're just trying to squeeze every bit of marketing juice they can get at the lowest possible cost by making a cheap, crappy product and then selling it to you. So tier 5, no good. And when it comes to all tiers, but especially the lower ones, you really want to look out for company founders and staff and people who actually take their own product. Because if people aren't taking their own product, that's also a red flag as well. So it's not really related to scientific studies, but it's something to watch for. Again, so stay away from people who don't get high in their own supply and also stay away from trashy tiers. So hope you found this helpful and I'll see you in the next video.